All right, so finally getting back to my series going through Star Trek Picard. This time I'm on the second to last episode of season 1, which is actually the first half of a two-parter, but I thought I would just slow down and talk about them as two separate episodes. So this video is just going to be part 1. Even though there are definitely some elements that go through both episodes, so that in a sense, for some parts, you can't really talk about the theme for the one episode without having the second half in the picture. But for those particular parts, I'm just going to focus on those more once I actually get to them in part 2. So at an Arcadia Ego part 1. This is the episode where they reach the 7th planet. Picard drops the news that he's going to die, and if anyone treats him like a dying man, it'll be a breach of protocol. And then Sutra gets everybody all keyed up onto the idea to summon the robo-apocalypse and wipe out humanity. Sutra, such a lore. Soong should have known better than to make another lore. But then, of course, it was Soong's dad, not him, who made the mistake the first time. So, these things just happen. Well, so I thought I would do a quick Google search, since I didn't have a stinking clue what in the heck the weird old Latin-sounding title could possibly mean, other than the fact that all good Trekkies must play Missile Command. But other than that, well, here's what Google gave me near the top of the search results. It gave me a little clip from Wikipedia. The literal translation of "et in Arcadia Ego" is "even in Arcadia, there am I." Posines, however you pronounce it, I have no idea. There's so many names in this paragraph. That guy's earliest biography, Giovanni Pietro Bellori, understood the "I" of the phrase to refer to death, thus making the painting a memento mori, reminding the viewer that even in the blissful utopia of Arcadia, death still exists. I love it. And this makes perfect sense for our episode. It's kind of a nice little synopsis of the idea of the episode in a sense. Not just because in part 2, the topic of death is going to be visited in a variety of ways. The whole butterfly being real kind of discussion, the part about Picard being revived as a synth, the part about Data wanting to stop existing, and then the whole continued ethical discussions that keep going and have been going about the ethics of killing. So death is, a big topic in a lot of those ways, but also because I think just this whole episode as a whole, it seems like a big part of the story concept for the episode is that they've found a perfect Star Trek utopia. Of course, it happens to be in danger, but they found this perfect Star Trek utopia. But before long, they discover that death and evil itself is right in the midst of them, within utopia, without having to come in from outside. It's within, through the manipulative deceptions of Sutra. And this is one more instance of Star Trek giving us a stereotypical picture-perfect utopia just so we can discover it isn't so great as we thought under the surface. Remember the city in the clouds back in the original series? Yeah, Trek just loves its deceptive utopias. Of course, one big difference from the city in the clouds to this one is that in this case, it really isn't all that bad. Whereas in the city in the clouds, it was built upon the slave labor of this abused culture. But in this case, the bad stuff presumably wasn't there until that turning point when Sutra reveals her true colors. Though, on second thought, you could argue that from what you see of Sutra and her very dark personality traits that come to the surface, you could argue that probably she just generally isn't the greatest person to have for a sister, and probably has done a lot of abuse behind Soong's back over the years. So yeah, probably a great big mar on the brilliant, beautiful palette of this utopia. Probably a great big mar on it that goes back quite a ways, making this utopia, not quite what we thought it was. So anyway, enough on that. Let's start walking through the episode from the beginning. First thing that happens is they come out of that very bumpy transwarp trip and find themselves in a quiet little empty part of space with a pleasant little planet in front of them named Coppelius. And I just noticed this last time I watched it, I just noticed this time around, it's such a funny little tidbit. Picard says to Jurati, "We just came 25 light years in 15 minutes. Why does that sound familiar? Why does 25 light years seem such a relatively small number, even though we know it's quite a big number for 15 minutes? Oh, that's it. A little bit of Star Trek numerology. 25 light years is 25,000 without the 1,000 part. And all the Voyager fans give a chuckle with a little knowing nod. Something about some old ship at some other time that went 25,000 light years in a quick moment. So Soji may be impressive, but she ain't got nothing on the caretaker. Anyway, let's not get lost in the weeds here. I'll have an 8-hour video on my hands. So next in this scene here on the ship, in this whole little interchange, we've got this as they fight. So when Narek shows up, we end up with a brief little interchange that continues the topic about the ethics of death that has been running through the series. We get this quick moment when it looks like Narek might be unconscious in his ship, and we get this quotable quote from Picard to Soji when he says, "There's a difference between killing an attacking enemy and watching a wounded one die." And we get a couple of those little quips from Picard that make him sound like this sagely old Gandalf figure or something, which is kind of cool. The way Patrick Stewart just has that way of saying the epic sayings, you know. But it's an interesting little, just kind of a one more little drop into this extended discussion on the ethics related to killing. In this particular little interchange, neither Picard nor Soji have any doubts about what they believe should be done here in this situation, but their ideas are completely different from one another. To Soji, it's a question of being played the fool by Narek, who is way too dangerous to have around anywhere. But to Picard, on the other hand, to Picard, having mercy on his enemies is a non-negotiable part of what it means to be Starfleet, or in his case, former Starfleet. So Picard gives the order to beam Narek into sickbay. Of course, before they could do that, a big old giant Borg cube gets in the way, you know, and they can't do it. And then that Borg cube is followed moments later by some weird old space flowers. Well, that was unexpected. Okay, yeah, so space flowers are kind of weird, but at least they're not as weird as a big giant green hand or a 1936 Ford up on the view screen. Orchids aren't half as weird as that. And it's not like these orchids are, let's say, out to merge Tuvok and Neelix into Tuvix, leaving their orchid print all over the Nevok uniform. I guess Star Trek has never been very good at letting us watch through an episode with a straight face. But the weirdness always has kind of a quirky charm to it. And even though these orchids do seem to come out of left field a little bit, it's definitely the standard kind of cheese that we're used to in Star Trek, and we like our cheese, let's be honest, once in a while. And actually, if you think back to the original series flavor just a little bit, floating space flowers are exactly the kind of thing we might expect some peace-loving space hippies to build to try to protect their utopia. Can't you picture the Galileo getting pulled down to Gamma Triangula 6 by a handful of cartoon space flowers? Just saying. All right, so anyway, Picard gets all weird because he's, you know, gonna die. And then we switch to the really beautiful title sequence. I always liked the credit sequence of Star Trek Picard season 1, but it just keeps growing on me and growing on me. So that's pretty cool. We get that gentle, peaceful transition after this kind of significant moment when nobody knew that Picard was, you know, had a condition, and they found out right when all this stuff's going on and the ship's shaking and stuff like that. And then we get this nice little peaceful intermission, giving us some of these symbolic reminders of the themes of Picard about a whole person coming together and about the meaningfulness and the beauty of you know, all this kind of stuff. Whatever you want to read into that, but it's beautiful no matter what you want to read into it. And then we're back. And we're back to finding out the sad news, or we already knew it, but you know, the Jurati finds out sad news about Picard's impending death, which he already knew, but no one else did. And Jurati just couldn't believe her eyes looking at that old school tricorder, which has got to be showing its age, rather than Picard being on his last leg. Oh, and I love the use of natural sunlight in these scenes. Jurati says, Chris manually opened the shutters. It's kind of like, in case we didn't notice it, we get a nice little reference to it. It makes it so that this whole episode feels like you're on a planet rather than obviously after they are on the planet. I'm not talking about before that, but so the whole episode feels like that. Rather than just being located inside messy spaceships for these early parts, spaceships that could be floating inside a nebula of doom out in an asteroid field or whatever, instead of giving us the sense that we are on this bright, pleasant planet on the edge of utopia, but just not quite inside utopia proper quite yet. It might not seem aesthetically significant if sunlight doesn't mean a lot to you, but sunlight has massive significance both symbolically in many different kinds of poetry and art throughout probably the history of humanity, but certainly all this, all the kinds of things that are in the modern era. It's one of those ubiquitous symbolic things, as well as just biologically for us humans. So it's often used poetically in all kinds of art forms to refer to goodness or knowledge or hope or a million other very meaningful things. And then just humanly speaking, sunlight has biological significance for us just in terms of how it influences our mood. So much so that for certain people who are especially sensitive to it, they can even experience seasonal affective depression from its absence. So because sunlight is such a aesthetically meaningful aspect, I think it's very fitting that there's a lot of sunlight in this utopia. When we do get to the utopia village scenes, there's a lot of sunlight there. And also just a nice little touch, I think, to bring that sunlight into these ruined spacecrafts in these earlier parts before we get to utopia proper. And I think it kind of gives a sense of calm and hopefulness, even while we're having these conversations about death and danger and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, there I go, getting lost in the blades of grass. So Picard tells everyone about his condition, and he kind of handles it in a way that kind of reminds us of good old Captain Picard of the Enterprise, because he basically says, I'm going to die, but there will be no further discussion, and don't you dare treat me like I'm dying. A little reminder that Picard is still the same old Picard, even though his personality has changed in so many ways. You could say there are certain kinds of emotions that still make him extremely uncomfortable, which is kind of a nice little realistic psychological touch that he's, like humans do, he's changed a lot, but there are certain things that haven't changed along the way, haven't changed, presumably, yet. And I love the line when they're on board the crashed cube with little bits of sunlight streaming in. I love the line where Elnor says, I may never see you again. And then Picard says in his quotable old sage kind of way, well, that's true of any two people who are saying goodbye. And the tone of voice that he uses, it almost sounds like you're supposed to kind of mentally take that line in and put it in cold storage in the back of your head for the next time you say goodbye to somebody. If we put this line, if we put it next to the existentialist themes that have been running throughout the series and the episode, it's kind of like here we get a nice little subtle reminder that you do have to consciously take note of it to notice it, but it is a nice little subtle reminder of the uncertainty, which is an existentialist, a significant theme within existential philosophy, of the uncertainty of everyday life, the inherent ambiguity built into all human relationships and all experiences of hope and desire and gratitude and gladness. Because life is brief, there is value in cherishing it. And how would we live differently if every day we recognized that goodbye you're saying could be a final one? Because in reality, it could be. Thanks, Picard. I think I'm trying to hang on to that one. All right, so then finally we do get to that very open, sunlit synth village utopia. It feels very classic Trek, the exact kind of utopia that we do have tended to see in Star Trek, and especially in The Next Generation, with the very ancient Greece kind of aesthetic, which is kind of a pattern in terms of what kinds of utopias we've tended to see and stuff like that. And then later on, once we get views of the interiors of the buildings and we get close-up looks at the buildings in general, they have a very Starfleet headquarters kind of look. So really the perfect combination for a little world created by these kinds of idealists within the Star Trek universe. I think it's perfect in the sense of like, this is one more example of how Picard season 1 has such great attention to the artistic style that's appropriate for taking traditional Star Trek and doing more of that, as opposed to just kind of who cares what, you know, the normal aesthetic for a Star Trek utopia would look like. Who cares what a Starfleet person would create if they went to a far off place and tried to create utopia. But in Picard season 1, they actually have, as I see it, when I look at it, I see a lot of great attention to the kind of artistic style that's appropriate for, you know, making more of classic Trek. So our first glance at this village looks very much like it's supposed to be the perfect, peaceful and high culture, but pleasantly minimalist utopia where everything is pleasant and positive and forward moving. But there's enough simplicity and natural aesthetic openness so that we or they don't get dragged down by all the technology and progress, but instead are set free by it to embrace and enjoy each present moment with all of its goodness. The perfect place, you could say, filled with the perfect people. People like Arcana, the first person you meet there, who speaks in this kind of conspicuous British accent, which I suppose is probably included to give her a kind of storybook quality, because she kind of sounds like she came out of a fairy tale. And in terms of personality, she seems kind of like a transition between Data and Soji in terms of her comprehension of emotions. So she has a naive and simplistic kind of disconnected aspect in terms of how she expresses her emotions, kind of like Data's kind of childlike side. But at the same time, she's quick to say that she feels particular feelings. You know, she's not trying to guess about feelings or something like that. She's actually saying, I feel such and such, you know, and presumably she's not pretending. She actually has inside her, she has feelings. And she's also very quick to draw symbolic and emotional significance to the subtleties around her, like the meaningful wrinkles on Picard's face. I guess that particular aspect is kind of like a reflective parent who meets a child she hasn't seen for a long time and then looks deep at all his facial features and says just how old and mature he is. Because even though Arcana has never seen Picard in person, presumably you would probably she's got some kind of memory built in from when she was built from the get-go. So that what stands out to her when she sees him, it's not like, oh, so this is what Picard looks like. But instead it's like, there's Picard and look at all those lines. But since she's a version of Data with much more inner emotional connectedness, you know, the connections within her, because of that, she finds existential significance in the lines on Picard's face. It reminds me a little bit of the scene in First Contact when Picard places his hand on the outside hull of that first warp ship. And Data is standing there, he doesn't understand it, so he asks, what are you doing? You know, but here in this case, it's kind of a Data 2.0, partway emotionally developed, not to the Soji level, but partway, you know, and she's all about that kind of thing. And then we meet Alton Soong. And I've got to say, I love every role that this actor plays in Star Trek, every single one. And of course, it is conspicuous that there's one more Soong walking around who looks exactly the same as all the other ones, but who cares? This one's just so great as a role. And then we meet Sutra, who is Jana's sister. I don't think Jana was supposed to be a lore mashup, but Sutra sure is. And then we get the unexpected mind meld and the plot twist that where we find out that the admonition was actually made for synths. Kind of a quirky plot twist, honestly. I don't think it's very well executed, the aspect of having Sutra kind of take this blind stab in the dark and be correct. You know, like she says, I think this is how it works. And then it turns out she's like completely correct, but she basically just made it up out of the blue, you know, but she was right. And especially, I think that's kind of a little odd way to do the plot twist, especially because we already established early on in episode, what was it, 3 or 4, when Troy showed up, we already established early on that Troy couldn't read Soji. So it's a bit out of the blue to suddenly have synths not only be capable of using psionic powers such as mind melding, but also actually the fact that the supernatural psionic energy in the admonition was actually made for synths. Kind of a bit of a quirky way of developing the story. Not anything I have a real problem with, but just I think at this scene, I think it could have been executed a little better so that it wasn't just this really kind of highly unlikely hunch that Sutra just magically knew, even though it's not supposed to be magical. You know, she just magically knew and then was completely correct. But and then there's the conversation between. So moving on to the next bit that I noted here in the episode, the conversation between Soong and Girardi, and I wrote down Soong's words where he says, "Lately, I've regained my interest in mind transfer, along with a certain sense of urgency." And then there's that golem staring at us. I think it's just kind of cool how they made that scene come out. It just came out really cool. Then we got the scene with the funny little purple ocarina. Yeah, there's that. Now it's really it's a really fun to watch little scene with the part where we see Raffi, quote unquote, breaking the rules with this great big old hug and a thank you to Picard, spoken specifically to Picard, the dying man version of Picard. You know, and then the whole back and forth about whether Picard is supposed to say "I love you" back to her. The discomfort that Picard clearly feels reminds us of the old Picard, who would have avoided this kind of situation like the plague. And of course, Picard did. He did make efforts to avoid this situation because remember, he demanded that nobody treat him like a dying man, that whole thing. But what makes this version of Picard different is that instead of going all cold and angry and trying to get away from Raffi once he's in that situation, instead, what ends up happening after some significant discomfort and some significant hesitation, what he ends up doing is saying it back to her. And we got Soji having her run in with the captured Narek, where Narek shows his unflinching ability to keep on spinning lies at the drop of a hat, and also his unflinching ability to turn any kind of emotion into a weapon without blinking. Same old Narek, but actually he's kind of worse than we saw him before because we never saw him being himself. We just saw him pretending, and then, you know, we saw the real Narek emerge. But and then after that, kind of for the rest of the episode, the set of scenes. So I don't know how many minutes this would be, but it's not a tiny portion, but it's a decent chunk that follows for the rest of the episode. And they're all kind of connected. It seems they're kind of connected by the topic of the discussion of ethics surrounding killing as the various plot elements unfold. So first, there's the discussion, and I really like this scene, the discussion between Picard and Soji inside Maddox's office, which feels so Starfleet headquarters in terms of, you know, this is the futuristic Federation style of a building. And this is the scene where Soji says, in regard to Girardi killing Maddox, and she's kind of seeing it as a choice Girardi made instead of just something that in the moment she thought she didn't have a choice, which is the way Picard said that. I don't think she thought she had a choice, you know. It wasn't some kind of logical choice she was trying to make. But anyway, Soji says in regard to that kind of decision, she says, "I guess I'm just trying to understand the logic of sacrifice." And Picard says, and I love this line, once again, it's this kind of sagely Gandalf-y kind of Picard, you know, way of talking. And Picard says, "The logic of sacrifice. I don't like the sound of that." And Soji says, "So you think there's no logic? No calculus of life and death?" And Picard says, "I think it depends on if you're the person holding the knife." I just love that interchange. I think that was actually one of the ones that back when Picard was, you know, fresh and it was just coming out, I think they published that on YouTube or something. It's just like one of those like shining, brilliant pieces of amazing film dialogue interchange. In terms of the ideas represented, sounds to me like a bit of a nod to the philosophical debates between moral relativism and moral absolutism. When Soji uses terms like calculus of life and death, it makes me think of descriptions I've heard of ethical theories that kind of suggests that no action is inherently right or wrong. Nothing is actually wrong, but instead we should evaluate an action based on what downstream benefits, way down the road, what downstream benefits or drawbacks we can predict it will have for future humanity. So the individual making a particular decision should make the best calculations that he or she can to see if a particular, perhaps morally questionable action, see whether it will end up loading onto something that he or she, or that we will think will be favorable on the larger scale of humanity, or whether it'll be something that will load onto, being less so. And Picard simply suggests that there's just something wrong with that idea. And the nature of sacrifice depends on who's holding the knife. I wonder also if it's a little bit of a nod back to the classic Star Trek line where Spock says in Star Trek II, and then it's been often repeated both in Star Trek and by fans since then, where he says his quotable quote, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few." And I mostly remember it from Tuvok saying, to quote Ambassador Spock, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few." And that's definitely a statement that I've heard criticized a number of times in terms of what it's representing, for it criticized as a pretty problematic way of looking at the world. If you really think that moral decisions of life and death can be made just by weighing the scales and outweighing the minority in favor of the majority, so you can cause harm to a few in order to benefit the many. And of course, that's not what Spock was using his logic for. That's not the decision he made. But since he expressed his choice as a mathematical application of this maxim, and we could say, if that maxim, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, if that maxim is anything more than an excuse, which of course Vulcans do make excuses for, non-computer-esque choices they make, but if that maxim is anything more than an excuse for an actually benevolent act of self-sacrifice, if it's more than that, then it does kind of lean in a questionable direction. But Picard here in this scene is saying the opposite. He's saying there is no calculus of life and death, and the moral nature of sacrifice is highly dependent on who's holding the knife. The discussion then transitions for Picard and Soji, into the specific topic that Soji is actually thinking about, which is the question of whether the synths and her, because she's with them, she's one of them, whether they ought to go ahead and summon the robo beasts to annihilate humanity and save themselves. So it's nice to hear that Picard isn't interested in a completely relativized morality, where moral action becomes a non-category and where pragmatism becomes a synonym for morality. That's nice to hear, but it's also intriguing to think that we may be left with a bit of an excluded middle during this Picard-Soji interaction, because it seems like Picard's approach that we see throughout the season is kind of an approach that just dogmatically and unhesitantly, without exception, will always choose to risk the lives of any number of innocent people in order to save a hardened murderer who plans to murder those who save him, regardless of the outcome. Like Bjayzl. Whereas the approach Soji is considering, on the other hand, would involve being open to murdering, kind of like the relativeness of things is so open that the position she's considering is where you would be open to murdering the innocent in order to save yourself or your tribe. And maybe that's part of why, and then she gives the suggestion that maybe killing is just a corollary of fear. Maybe that's what it is. So it could be suggested that part of the reason Soji's difficulty, her dilemma, is so tense is because there's kind of an excluded middle between her, on the one hand, her completely relativized ethic that will do anything for self-preservation, between that as an option, and then Picard's idealistic alternative that views any conceivably possible act of mercy should be viewed as a moral imperative, regardless of the circumstance. Kind of between being an animal who will do anything to survive. Fear is, or murder is a corollary of fear. killing is a corollary of fear. Between that and being naively taken advantage of by others. So maybe you could suggest it's because Soji has this kind of false dichotomy as the primary set of alternatives she's considering. She's kind of only got two options in her head. Maybe it's because of that she's extremely vulnerable to the lore-like narcissistic rhetoric that Sutra is kind of preaching out with kind of almost like a cult leader kind of aura. It's kind of the vibe you get when Sutra gets up there and she just kind of spouts out all this rhetoric. After all, if you remember, it was right after Soji's discussion with Picard. It was right after that she heard the scream. They found Saga killed, presumably killed by Narek. And Soji's words were, "I should have killed him. I wanted to kill him. Why didn't I?" So maybe because of the kind of false dichotomy, these two options, that kind of false dichotomy as the reigning paradigm of options for her from that discussion with Picard moments earlier, maybe you could say that it seems to her that Narek's persistent evil, you show him a little bit of mercy by keeping him alive, and what does he do? Narek's persistent evil kind of served as a refutation of Picard's idea that it's better to be moral and preserve and protect people like Narek. And since there are only two options on the table for Soji, then if Picard's idealized morality seems to be refuted, that leaves her with the alternative, which is the fact that killing is just a corollary of fear, presumably because humans are just kind of more advanced versions of animals that fight one another for the purpose of survival. That's morality, or the absence of morality. They're one and the same. And so what happens with Soji is she kind of bends like a playing card. She bends to the rhetoric of Sutra, who says that we must, and we have the right to, take what is ours by calling for the extermination of the humans. The idea that there will be a far greater good by our survival and the continued evolution of artificial life. And Soji is taken, kind of like a vulnerable cult follower. She's taken in by Sutra, in spite of her prior deep connection with this father figure who has shown so much concern and love for her. And you can tell she's struggling with it. She's not like she's just kind of blowing off Picard. She clearly cares what he thinks and cares, about his opinion and stuff, but she's taken in by Sutra. So yeah, really intriguing psychological dilemmas in this episode, not without some real ethical issues to think through and explore. Definitely some really thought-provoking aspects to this episode. A lot of good stuff in here. And then right at the end, we also get the last of all these many instances of these parts where Picard overrates his influence as the great Picard. This is the bit where he says, if you guys get on my ship and flee with me, then I'll fight for you and I'll demand Starfleet end the band and the Federation will listen to me. He definitely should have known better than to say that, since he's made that exact same mistake like 4 or 5 times already in season 1. But it did give us a great opportunity to get to hear Soong say in his perfect tone of voice, "No, they won't," in the way that only Brent Spiner could pull that off. A very un-Data way of talking. And then Soong basically gives the keys of the community, because he's the overlord, so to speak. He's the great father, the great patriarch, if you will, of this whole community. So he's really got sway, complete sway over these people. He basically gives the keys of the community over to Sutra and her rhetoric by putting his approval against Picard and for Sutra's plan. I guess his blind spot that put him under Sutra's spell, in a way, was probably just the fact that he would do anything for his children, and he didn't value the rest of humanity to the same level as his children. Probably partly because he didn't think his children could do any harm. It was the perfect children versus the other people, the infected, sinful people. Things became different for him, I think, later on, once he finds out. I think the important part was when he found out that Sutra was the one who killed Saga. And of course, I'm talking about part 2, which I haven't seen for a long time. So, hopefully I'm remembering it correctly, but at least presumably you'd think that would be the part that makes the big difference, because it changes the paradigm. Because if so, then it's because that's the part where once he finds out that Sutra was the one who killed Saga, that's what Saga forget if they pronounced it saga or saga. I just have it written in my notes here as, SAGA, but this would be, once he discovered that, would be when he discovered that death is actually in the camp, not coming in from outside. When he discovers that we are all infected with the call of darkness, death, and inner evil. Soong's ethic, in his choice here, his ethic called for the preservation of the perfect people at any cost. But he didn't know that he didn't have the kind of utopia he thought he did. So that's that. Picard goes under house arrest. And then part 2 begs you to hit autoplay. But last night I just said in my rebellious way, I'm not hitting autoplay. I'm going to watch part 1 again. I'm going to write an essay discussing psychological and moral talking points and come back later. You don't control me, autoplay button. I guess it's just my rebel nature.